Senator Reid.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Governor Trul, let me begin with you. You and your colleagues have a complicated challenge implementing the Volcker rule, and that's, to me, a broader issue with respect to how derivatives and complicated instruments are going to be treated on the books of these major companies. It's complicated. That's why Congress directed the agencies to do it, because the process of reaching out, getting opinions from the affected industry, getting comments, et cetera, is something that in our legislative process we don't do as systematically. But the other complicating factor here, too, is there's, I think, clearly been an attack on the budgets of the agencies so that their resources are in question, whether they can carry out some of these sophisticated issues. And we're also seeing at least the potential for challenges at the Circuit Court on Administrative Procedure Acts with respect to the economic analysis. And I find that interesting because that wasn't even part of Dodd-Frank. That's a predecessor statute that called for consideration of the economic consequences, not a cost-benefit analysis. I think the courts are writing a lot into that statute. But all of that having been said, in this period of time where it's very difficult to deploy effective rules with respect to Volcker, with respect to clearing platforms, with respect to the treatment of derivatives, the only fallback I think you have is capital. Capital that will assure the Congress and the American public that they will not have to go in and once again, as they did in 2008, and provide huge direct financial support, and as we've discovered recently, indirect financial support through the borrowing facilities of the Fed. Is that your perspective? Are you prepared to and explicitly consider the additional capital that these institutions must bear if we cannot effectively deploy these rules?
Senator, as I indicated earlier, we have been proceeding with the improvement of capital regulation across the board. With respect to the trading side of major institutions, where obviously the Volcker rule has particular salience, we are on the verge of putting out a proposed regulation along with our fellow banking agencies, which would implement the so-called Basel 2.5 rules. Those are the ones applicable to the trading books. Secondly, when we did the capital review exercise earlier this year, and as we undertake it again, which we've just begun to do for early 2012, we have included for our largest institutions a so-called trading book shock, something which would essentially build on the 2008 shock to traded assets to stress test them under the current environment. This year, we've also added a specifically European component to that, taking into account the potential impact on sovereigns in the EU. The reason I mention the stress test part of this is back to the point I made in my introductory remarks, that we need a dynamic as well as a static picture of capital. And so what we try to do in these stress tests is to say, assume an adverse scenario, assume bad things happening, both in the banking book and the trading book, and make sure that the firms could sustain the kinds of losses associated with that adverse scenario and still emerge sufficiently well capitalized to be a viable financial intermediary. So I absolutely think that capital is central here. As I realize I've become a bit of a broken record on this, but I do think that capital is the foundation for a well-structured financial regulatory system, which definitely needs to be complemented with other forms of regulation.
But without these other forms of regulation, then, and I don't want to put words in your mouth, it would seem to me that the capital level would be some percentage point higher because you don't have these other complementary, transparent platforms or rules.
When we set capital requirements, we do try to look at how those requirements relate to other regulatory arrangements. So I think it is the case that in the absence of, for example, restrictions on proprietary trading, we would we would need to look at the potential losses associated with an unregulated proprietary trading undertaking.
So there is a point, at least analytically, at which if the Volcker Rule was adopted and these other measures, more effective use of clearing platforms, more products being traded, cleared rather than over-the-counter bilateral transactions, that potentially at least capital would not be as high for banks. And I find one of the ironies is that the industry and others are fighting so hard against these, and they may end up with higher capital levels that impede their ability to lend, to participate in the economy. And I guess the moral of the story is, at least I hope it is, you can't have it both ways. You
Well,
can't undermine all of these regulatory structures and expect to have very low capital levels, because there's no protection for the taxpayer.
Certainly, the riskiness of a particular asset is affected by the regulatory environment in which that asset can be purchased. And I think that is a core point. Obviously, if a firm is able to take on a substantial portfolio of risky assets, capital requirements will have to be higher.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.